such a time as this.
And welcome back to For Such a Time as This, the place where there is no such thing as a silent witness. Have a really good video to share with you today. I usually put out on the YouTube comments of each video, and oftentimes I ask people who have a different opinion to come on and to share their different opinions. No one has taken me up on that offer until today. Logan had I don't want to say a disagreement. Yeah, a disagreement, but a different point of view when it came to evolution. He believes in evolution and wanted to come on and share in a friendly debate about evolution and creationism. And so, again, I say this to the audience, and I say it to Logan also. My goal is not to win an argument, but to represent Christ and to win hearts. And so with that said, thank you so much, Logan, for being willing to come on for such a time as this and present your view. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Logan wanted to start off with the definition of evolution. So, Logan, the floor is yours. The definition of evolution.
Okay. Evolution is defined as change in allele frequency in a population over generations. This does not mean like, it's not at the species level, it happens at the population level. This is an important distinction to make because a lot of people can be confused.
This is a different definition, yeah. So you're saying evolution is no longer the mutation of an organism. Is that what you're saying?
No. Change in allele frequency can happen through multiple different methods. Mutation is one of them, but it is not the only way that this happens.
Say that term again. A what?
Change in allele frequency.
What is define allele frequency for me, please?
So in a population, you have a pool of genes that all the organisms have and that share as they interbreed, and as certain traits can be introduced into this gene pool and other traits will disappear. And that's essentially what a change in allele frequency is, where you have, let's say you have a population of like all white rabbits, then say a brown rabbit migrates in, and now you have the brown gene has been introduced to this gene pool, and the population naturally not even through any sort of selection pressure, just through time going on, you have this gene will appear in, assuming this rabbit breeds, we'll have more of the population having this brown fur.
Now
that is a change in the allele frequency.
Well, that's not evolution because you were responding to a discussion we had when we were specifically, I think, talking about evolution in the classical sense as it relates to the Bible. And so what you're talking about, traits, brown eyes, blue eyes, blonde hair, brown hair, that's not what Christians, and that's not what the show had a disagreement on. We would agree with you. Those things happen. Some people have blue hair, some people have, blonde hair, some people have brown hair. That's not the classical definition of evolution. That's not Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was species jump. So in your allele frequencies, are you accounting for allele? Is your understanding of allele jumps species jumps? Allele frequency species jumps?
Allele frequency can result in a speciation event under the right conditions where generally gene flow is not happening between these two populations. Usually reproduction has an effect. It generally occurs from isolation because as time goes on, genetic drift will gradually shift the genes of the gene pool of certain organisms. It might get rid of a trait, or one trait might become hegemonic in the population.
Now you're saying traits. You're talking about recessive and dominant traits. No one will deny or debate that. We all agree on that. I think what I want to focus on is the species jump, because that is what Christians object to. That is what the show objected to. So we're in perfect agreement that different traits happen, right? I do believe that within species, when, again, from the Christian perspective, Ham goes down into Africa And then the people from Africa, because of the arid conditions and the very humid and hot conditions, I do believe over time developed traits that would help them adapt better to the climate. And no one debates that. It's the species jump that I guess we will differ on. So let's focus on that. Everyone agrees with the traits, different traits over time.
Right.
It's the species jump. So,
yeah. So what I'm trying to say here is, so you have two populations. They're the same species. Let's just say there's a mountain between them. They don't want to cross that mountain. It's difficult to cross. They tend to avoid crossing it. So these two populations, which originally had the exact same gene flow, a mechanism called genetic drift, will just it's essentially can be considered survival of the luckiest. Selection pressure plays no part in this. All that's happening is these organisms are just surviving, reproducing, and by chance, some of their genes will flow towards longer hair or shorter hair. And what this does is creates important differences in the genes of these same species. Since they are not interbreeding from that barrier that's blocking them from crossing into each other's population, they are not interbreeding, and therefore the gene flow is not happening. So gene flow essentially is where traits can be spread across the population. So if these two populations are not experiencing gene flow, they will accumulate differences in their DNA that will add up to causing reproductive barriers. Whether it's pre-zygotic or post-zygotic is dependent on a lot of circumstances, but speciation happens because of these genetic differences that arise over time of these organisms, just even if there's no selection pressure. And selection pressure can increase the speed that this happens.
I got you. So what is the evidence for species variation? And by that you mean one species gives birth to something that's not part of its own species, correct?
This isn't quite exactly it, because it's not one species. It's not like a frog giving birth to like a fish or something. That's not an accurate representation. This happens at the species level, so it's never going to be just like a snap of your fingers and suddenly boom, new species. It's more of a gradual kind of a gradation, like a gradient. You have these specific situations where organisms are very close to diverging, called ring species, where you have an organism that can breed with another, but it's difficult to specifically call them part of the same species or part of different species, but by the biological species model, they can reproduce, so they still fit in the same species. But as this ring goes around, each organism mates with its close neighbor, but then the further down the ring you go, one organism won't be able to mate with one of the previous
so you have a different species.
Yes, essentially, because they cannot mate and produce viable fertile offspring.
The question is there any evidence for one species giving birth to something that's not its own species? Do you understand what I'm saying? If you're gonna say at one point it can no longer mate because it's not the same species, then at one point a species has to give birth to something that's a different species, right?
Not necessarily, because think about it like this: you have these are at population levels. You have a group of I'm going to give an example that I don't exactly remember the details. I'm trying to find it, so you have to work with me here while I describe it. So this population of beetle clung to I think it was just a piece of plant that got blown out in a storm and ended up on an island. So the previous population that's on the mainland is still there. They're still surviving, reproducing, but these new beetle population has started on an island, and this population is going to slowly change just through gene flow, and even, like, again, there doesn't even need to be selection pressure for this to happen.
But at some point, that beetle's going to give birth to something that didn't originally come over on that leaf.
Through reproduction, there will be slight, you don't have the exact same traits as both your parents. You don't have all the same
And
traits.
no
as
one
your
debates
parents,
that. Yep.
Obviously.
Yep. But I'm saying at some point, that beetle is going to give birth to a beetle that's not part of the original species that came over on the leaf.
Right, and this happens from the gradual changes that gene flow causes.
I get you. So, is there any evidence of species jump?
Yeah, give me a second. I'm sorry, I should have been prepared for this. Let me get it. I have some articles that sorry, I have a billion tabs open.
You go ahead. You go ahead and do that, and then, because we're already at like almost 12 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's my question. You give your evidence, and then I'm going to give just a Christian general overview of what the Christian view of species jump is. Go ahead.
One sec. Sorry. I have a lot of tabs open. Thanks, college. All right. So this is an example of, actually, if you want just plain examples of speciation, we've done this in the lab a lot. Let me... All right, here. Okay. So, crap. Sorry, one sec. All right. So, let's see, what's a good example here? There have been a lot of speciation events that we've actually observed. Usually with fruit flies, because they have very short generation times, and thus it's easier to accumulate those differences that bar reproduction. So all right. Dobzhansky and Pavlovsky, 1971, reported a speciation event that occurred in a laboratory culture of Drosophila polystorum. God, I can't read those. Sometime in between 1958 and 1963, the culture was descended from a single inseminated female that was captured in Llanos of Colombia in 1958. This strain produced fertile hybrids when crossed with species of different strains of Orinocan from 1963 onward. Essentially, you have initially no sort of mating or behavioral isolation was seen between a Llanos strain and the Orinocan strains. Later on, had produced a sort of mating. So a sort of mating is where they will not mate; they refuse to mate with each other.
Okay.
Actually.
So in that lab, did a fly give something birth or something not a fly?
No, it was always a fly, but these species would no longer mate with each other.
So okay. So how is that evidence of a fly giving birth to something that's not a fly?
Well, flies will always give birth to flies. That's
So there's no species jump.
Speciation is where two separate populations will not be able to interbreed. That is according to the biological species concept.
But how does that further the notion of evolution, that somehow an amoeba ends up being a man?
Well, for that happens, we actually have observed multicellularity we added filter feeders to a colony of a bunch of single-celled organisms, and the single-celled organisms began to cluster around each other and form a multicellular sort of organism to stop being eaten by the filter feeders, and that was done in a very short period of time. So
And so an amoeba,
multicellularity.
reproduced something that wasn't an amoeba.
It was multicellularity. These are single-celled organisms. They added filter feeders that couldn't eat them if they were a certain size, and these single-celled organisms had developed multicellularity to defend themselves from this filter feeder.
All right, we're coming up. We're past 15 minutes. Maybe we'll do another one. But real quickly, from the, let me just put it out there: the Christian view on evolution. Evolution, according to Charles Darwin, who popularized it, and as you said, we talked before the show, they had some people who had certain views Charles Darwin had, but he popularized in the origin of the species, right? And so his whole thing was, at some point an amoeba reproduced something that wasn't an amoeba. At some point a frog gave birth to something that was not a frog. And at some point an ape gave birth to something that was not an ape, i.e. a man. And so the Christian perspective and our rationale against species jump is based on it. And on the screen, I'm going to bring it up. I typed in genetic mutations, list of, and it came up even on Wikipedia, which I don't always trust, but even on Wikipedia, and I've looked at other things, when I typed in positive genetic mutations, it popped up a list of genetic disorders. And it brings up this, common disorders, and you'll see them listed here, anywhere from, let's see here, color blindness, cystic fibrosis, Down syndrome, and it shows the chromosome in which the mutation is. Is mutated 15, 17, 17, 5, 7Q. You see them down here, and it goes down to Turner syndrome. And then you have the full genetic disorder list. Look how big that is. It's huge. I didn't realize it was that big, but it's huge. It is absolutely huge. And so the whole genetic thing is that when a gene mutates, in my understanding and in my study, it's always a negative thing. It's never a good thing. In the world we live in the laboratory we live in, mutations are never a good thing. It's always a bad thing. And a lot of times, the organism is not only hindered, but dies. And so, Logan, understanding that from the Christian perspective, are you aware of any genetic mutation in human beings that causes something positive?
All right. So in what you said on apes is really quick, apes is a large descriptive group. Humans actually do fall into apes. You cannot describe all apes without also describing humans.
No, I can, because I don't believe they're the same, though. I believe humans are distinctly different than apes.
Just by the definition of apes that biologists use, humans fall into it. But
okay, that's fine, and your biologist may do that. But I'm saying, for the most part, traditionally speaking, and from my camp, we don't. You guys can, we don't. But here's the question, because we're running short on time.
Right. Okay.
My question is, are you aware of any mutations in human beings that actually is positive for the organism and not negative?
Yes. So
you are aware of mutations that are positive in human beings?
Yes.
Okay, which ones? Name one.
Well, for one, there is lactase persistence. In humans, the ability to digest lactase past adulthood is not the norm. But in Europe, around the time where we started cultivating lots of cows, we had lots of dairy products. Being able to digest the lactase past adulthood, because children can do it obviously, but then after a certain point they just stop producing lactase. Lactose is the sugar. Lactase is the molecule used to break it down.
What gene is that a mutation on? Which gene?
I do not remember. I could find it, but that would take a bit of time. Here's another example.
And so, wait, hold on. So you're saying that the ability for humans to drink milk is a mutation?
The ability to do it past adulthood.
You mean in adulthood, right?
Yeah, like you lose the ability. The norm is to lose the ability. Lactose intolerant people, they lose that ability to produce lactase, which breaks down lactose.
Yeah, but
they lose that ability past adulthood.
Most adults can drink milk.
Yeah, that's because this mutation has spread across the population. This occurred in around the time where dairying was very common, and in a food shortage where you have milk, if you can digest milk, that is heavy selection pressure towards that mutation. If you look at the population of people who do have this mutation, you'll see that it's very prevalent in places like Europe, but certain other places where dairying was not common, like I think South America, it's not common at all.
So, but here, we have documentation from thousands of years ago that humans have always been drinking milk, whether it's goat's milk or cow's milk or whomever's milk. Humans have always been able to drink milk. How is that a mutation?
Drinking milk and digesting milk are not necessarily the same thing. A lactose intolerant person can still drink milk. And where this originally came from, I don't think is entirely yet known, like the exact when it exactly appeared. I'd have to do more research.
So let me ask you this. So what you're saying is a theory that at some point, the theory is it mutated somewhere in the past, and we don't really know when that mutation took place, or even if it took place at all.
Well, we do know that previously a large portion of the population did not have this mutation. They were not able to digest it.
How do we know that?
Simple genetics. We can trace back lineages before this change happens. And we see that, again, the populations of humans on Earth fit, and where dairying was common, and where it's uncommon, we don't see this change.
But the mere fact, here's the thing, the mere fact that you don't see it and you can't prove it in a laboratory today in 2020, that makes it a theory, right? Because, again, it's been many, many moons before, but science is defined by the scientific method, correct?
Yes.
Anything outside the scientific method is technically a theory, correct?
In science, a theory is okay. So when you propose an explanation to an observed phenomenon,
I'm sorry, Logan.
You can have different levels.
We're out of time. We're gonna have to come back another one. I mean, another time.
Okay.
But here's my stance. Is that as much as we can see in a laboratory in genes, there's not one positive mutation that we can see in a laboratory that's positive to human beings. What you are describing is a theory, and my understanding of science, it's a theory because you can't prove it in a laboratory. There's not one gene. I've actually spoken to a family member who is a physician. He's been a physician for many, many years. He could not name it. He couldn't name it. And he admitted that there was nothing in the laboratory, not one positive gene, that resulted in a positive thing for a human being. Whether it was all types of diseases or disorders, it was always negative. Everything else outside of that is a theory. Now he's older than I. He's in his 70s, almost 80s. I'm close to 50 now. Maybe this is some new stuff that's going on in the colleges today, but as it stands, mutations are always negative, not positive. Here's the second one. We got to end with this because I'm way long now. Here's the second one. You and I were not there when mankind began. I've read about it. I believe in the Bible. You've read about it in your books. You and I weren't there. I believe that God created the universe to produce after its own kind. Chickens give birth to chickens, lions give birth to lions, humans give birth to humans. That's what I believe, and I see it every day. Am I right to assume that at some point you believe that species gave birth or reproduced something other than species, that man ultimately came from a lower life form? Is that true?
Species giving birth to another species isn't accurate. It's
Okay.
at the population level. It does not happen as a clear defined
Okay.
line.
Do you believe that mankind came from a lower species?
I don't believe there's such a thing as lower species. I don't think you can objectively say this species is lower than X species. I don't think you can say objectively that a frog is like lower than a bug.
So okay, so you believe that
I don't think there's any
man.
way to say that.
Okay, so you think that man came from something other than a man?
Yes, common ancestry is very well evidenced.
Okay, so man came from something other than a man. Have you ever seen that in your lifetime? Have you ever seen humans give rise to something other than humans? Have you ever seen an ape give birth to something other than an ape? Have you ever seen a dog give birth to something other than a dog in your lifetime? Have you ever seen that?
And no, but that's because that's not how it happens. It's way more gradual. It's not like all of a sudden you have a new species.
I got you.
The population as a whole is slowly diverging from another population.
I got you.
It's
That's your
relative
belief.
to it.
That's your belief. What I'm saying is, I see what I believe every day. Men give birth to men, dogs give birth to dogs. You have never seen what you say you believe, right? My question is, which one takes more faith to believe? Your system or my system?
I'd like to present more evidence, but I understand that you're out of time. So
Okay, we'll come back another time, but you're right. We're out of time. Thank you for looking at for such a time as this as we sit and discuss and even debate these very important topics. Thank you and see you soon.
For such a time as this.